The billionaire laughed as a black waiter slowly set a wine bottle on the table. The entire ballroom fell silent. Everyone watched the single father in a worn server's uniform, convinced he had just destroyed his own career. Moments earlier, billionaire CEO Victoria Mercer had mocked his job, his shoes, and even asked if his 10-year-old daughter was ashamed of having a waiter as a father. But there was one strange detail no one noticed. The waiter had glanced at Victoria's tablet for less than 3 seconds and quietly recognized 3 hidden flaws inside the billion-dollar platform she was about to launch. In the next 90 seconds, everyone in that room would realize they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. They thought they were humiliating an ordinary waiter. They had no idea they were standing in front of the man who had actually built the technology. If you've ever been judged by your appearance or made to feel like you didn't belong, this story is for you. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Damon Price had spent 7 years making sure no one recognized his name. How many shifts would it take you to afford shoes like mine? God, billionaire Victoria Mercer asked, drawing nervous laughter from her guests. All evening she had mocked Damon Price, a black single father working as a waiter for his uniform, his age, and the way he spoke with too much confidence for someone in his position. But when Victoria asked whether his 10-year-old daughter felt ashamed of him, Damon slowly set down the wine bottle. "Mock me again, I dare you." Victoria smiled until Damon quietly named the 3 hidden flaws her billion-dollar platform had spent 3 months trying to bury. Within seconds, the most powerful woman in the room had nothing left to say. Astor House smelled like candle wax and expensive perfume, and Damon Price had learned to move through that smell without letting it remind him of anything. Rubin liked to say that Damon remembered names the way other men remembered scores, and that he could talk a nervous vineyard question into a confident answer without ever making a guest feel small for asking it. The other servers at Astor House often asked Damon how he stayed so unbothered on the busiest nights when tempers ran short and tips ran thin, and he never had a complicated answer for them. He told them the work itself demanded nothing more than attention and patience, 2 things he'd learned to give freely once he stopped measuring his worth by what other people assumed about the uniform he wore. 7 years earlier, Damon had been the lead engineer and co-founder of Crestline Systems, the architect behind a supply chain forecasting platform so advanced that competitors spent years trying to reverse engineer it. He had designed the core structure himself, the part that let the whole system bend instead of break when markets shifted without warning. Then his daughter Mila, 3 years old at the time, had been diagnosed with a heart defect that required emergency surgery the family's insurance would only partially cover. He never regretted it. Mila lived, grew, learned to ride a bike, and eventually turned 10 years old in the small Brooklyn apartment Damon now called home. Victoria Mercer walked into Astor House that evening with the practiced ease of someone who had never once worried about being seated. She was 42 years old, the chief executive and largest shareholder of Mercer Access, and the kind of leader business magazines love to photograph beside words like visionary and disruptor. She arrived with her chief of staff Helena Marlowe and a small group of advisors, all of them there to finalize details for the upcoming launch of a platform called Horizon. Victoria had genuinely built Mercer Access from a regional player into a global name, and she believed with total sincerity that this achievement gave her the right to define the people around her however she saw fit. That belief had calcified over years of boardrooms where nobody dared correct her, years of headlines calling her fearless and uncompromising, until the line between confidence and cruelty had blurred so completely in her own mind that she no longer noticed when she crossed it. She had convinced herself somewhere along the way that kindness towards strangers was a luxury reserved for people who hadn't earned the right to demand more from the world around them. She decided within the first minute that Damon was beneath her notice, and she never once used his name even after he introduced himself. She called him waiter, the way another person might call a chair, and when he offered a recommendation from the wine list, she cut him off and asked him to recite 3 vintages the restaurant did not carry. Watching his face for the stumble she expected, it never came. Damon answered calmly, correctly, and without a trace of defensiveness. And something about that composure seemed to irritate Victoria more than any mistake would have. "You speak awfully well for someone doing this job." Helena Marlowe felt the comment land wrong, but stayed quiet, unwilling to disrupt a dinner that was supposed to end in a signed agreement between Mercer Access and the restaurant's parent hospitality group. When Damon's eyes drifted briefly toward a tablet propped open near Victoria's elbow, she pulled it toward herself before he could see anything more than a flicker of a diagram. "Don't worry about that," she told him, not looking up. "That's not something you need to understand. Just make sure my glass doesn't sit empty. Victoria kept going because Damon's calm refused to give her the reaction she was hunting for. She asked how many shifts a man his age would need to work to afford shoes like hers, and she said she had met people like him before, people who spent a few evenings in a nice room and started imagining they belonged there. Damon refilled her water glass without a word, his jaw tight, his hands perfectly steady. Then Victoria asked whether his daughter was proud of him or whether the girl avoided mentioning to her friends that her father was a waiter. She asked almost gently whether he was teaching his child that the world owed his family something. That question did what the others hadn't. Damon set the wine bottle down on the table slowly, deliberately, the sound of glass meeting linen, the only thing that broke the silence at table 9. "Mock me again," he said, his eyes steady on hers. "I dare you." Victoria smiled, the expression of someone who believed she had finally provoked a reaction she could use against him. "Let's not turn your unprofessionalism into a conversation about prejudice," she said. "I treat every member of staff exactly the same." "No," Damon answered, his voice even. "You treat everyone badly. You just choose certain people to look down on more than others." The table went completely silent, forks resting untouched against china, until one of the advisors cleared his throat and reached for the tablet, angling it slightly to show Victoria something on the screen. He said nothing. He finished pouring water at the neighboring table, first unhurried, giving himself the time to look again without appearing to look at all. What caught him wasn't the branding or the polished interface layered over the top. He circled the table once more, refilling glasses, and let his gaze fall on the diagram a second time, longer now, confirming what he'd seen. The way the data layers were stacked matched a structure he had designed by hand. This was not a coincidence, and it was not a resemblance. This was his work sitting inside a presentation for a product Victoria Mercer was about to introduce to the world as her own. He said the system as shown would overreact to short-term market swings. He said it would misallocate inventory at scale under exactly the wrong conditions. Victoria went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with composure. Helena Marlowe looked at Damon now with an expression that had shifted from discomfort into something closer to disbelief. Victoria recovered quickly, snapping back into the voice she used in boardrooms, and demanded that Rubin fire him on the spot, threatening to cancel every event contract Mercer Access held with the restaurant's parent company. By the next morning, Victoria had already begun digging into the background of a waiter she'd never bothered to learn the name of, and what she found stopped her cold. Damon Price had been the founding architect of Crestline Systems, the very platform Mercer Access had acquired and quietly folded into the foundation of Horizon. Damon understood, driving home to Brooklyn that night, that Victoria would not simply let the matter rest. He could stay silent, protect the ordinary life he had built for Mila, and let the humiliation fade the way so many others had. Or he could stand against a woman with money, media, and power on her side, and risk everything he'd rebuilt since the day he signed away his company to save his daughter's life. He pulled into the small lot behind his building and sat behind the wheel for a moment, replaying the dinner in his head. He thought of Renee, gone 3 years now, and how she used to tell him that dignity wasn't something you had to prove to a room, only something you refused to let a room take from you. He had believed her once. Tonight had tested that belief in a way nothing had since the hospital. He sat in the dark kitchen afterward, turning the evening over slowly. He had spent 7 years building a life where no one asked about Crestline, where his name meant nothing to strangers, and that anonymity felt like safety rather than loss. I thought about calling Rubin, then decided against it. Not out of distrust, but because he needed one night to sit with the decision alone before it became something other people had opinions about. Somewhere in that quiet, staring at the reflection of the stove light against the dark window, Damon understood that the version of himself who could simply return to work tomorrow and act as though nothing had happened no longer existed. By the time Damon woke the next morning, the story had already outgrown the dining room where it started. A video clip had surfaced online 11 seconds long, beginning at the exact moment he set the wine bottle down and spoke. The clip spread the way clips like that always spread, fast and without context, shared by people who had never sat at table 9 and never would. News anchors repeated the framing without questioning it, and strangers online debated his tone of voice as if 11 seconds could ever hold an entire evening inside it. Nobody asked what came before the clip began. Nobody seemed to want to. Victoria appeared in front of cameras that afternoon with the composed sorrow of someone who had rehearsed grief in a mirror. She added almost as an afterthought that she had always believed deeply in equality and opportunity, and that comments suggesting otherwise misunderstood everything she stood for. In 4 sentences, she managed to make herself the injured party, erase everything Damon had actually experienced, and turn a man who had stood perfectly still into someone the public should fear. Watching the clip later that day, Damon found himself almost impressed by how effortlessly she'd done it. The same steady voice she must have used 100 times in boardrooms now aimed squarely at rewriting a story she herself had started. Reuben watched the interview from the back office at Astor House, arms crossed, jaw tight enough to ache. He the full footage saved on a drive in his desk drawer, unedited, every insult intact, and it took real effort not to release it himself that same hour. He didn't not yet, because he understood something Victoria clearly didn't expect anyone around her to understand. He locked the drive back in his drawer and told himself the moment for it would come, even if he didn't yet know when. Around the restaurant, the mood shifted in ways Damon felt even before anyone said a word to him directly. A few coworkers offered quiet nods of support in the hallway, careful not to be seen doing it near management. Others avoided him entirely, unsure whether standing too close to the controversy might cost them their own shifts. Damon understood both reactions and blamed neither. The video reached Mila's school before Damon even had a chance to explain it to her in his own words. A classmate told her that her father had threatened a billionaire and might go to jail, repeating language he'd obviously heard from an adult at home who had watched the same news segment Victoria gave that afternoon. Another classmate asked if it was true that her family was poor and angry about it, a question that clearly came from somewhere beyond a 10-year-old's own imagination. "Did you really scare her?" Damon knelt down to her level the way he always did when something mattered enough to require his full attention and told her the truth plainly. He hadn't threatened anyone. He had simply refused to let a woman use his daughter to make him feel small, and he wasn't sorry for that, whatever the internet decided to call it. "She asked me things about you first," Damon said, before I ever said a word back to her. "Nobody online is showing that part, but you know me and I need you to trust what you know over what a stranger's video says." Mila believed him the way she always believed him, without needing anything more than the calm certainty in his voice. She asked one more question before heading to her room quieter than the first. "Is it because we're not rich like her?" Damon told her it wasn't about money at all, though he understood exactly why a 10-year-old watching adults argue about a billionaire would land on that explanation first. He told her some people simply decided who mattered before they ever learned anything true about them, and that had nothing to do with what her family did or didn't have. Watching her carry her backpack back to her room that evening, Damon understood something had shifted permanently. Whatever happened next wasn't only about his own dignity anymore. It was about whether his daughter would grow up believing the world could be corrected with the truth, or whether she'd learn early that money and headlines simply decided who got believed. Helena Marlowe called 2 days later and asked to meet somewhere away from the office, somewhere quiet away from anyone who reported to Victoria. "I told myself the negotiation mattered more than staying quiet for one evening," she said. "That was a lie I needed to hear less than you needed to hear the truth." The park was mostly empty that afternoon, just a few joggers passing along the path, and Damon didn't soften the moment for her comfort. "You didn't stay quiet because you didn't understand what was happening," he told her. "You stayed quiet because the contract mattered more to you than my dignity did, right up until it became inconvenient not to notice." Helena had no answer for that, and to her credit, she didn't try to manufacture one. She sat with the accusation instead of flinching from it, which told Damon more about her than any apology could have. "Prejudice doesn't only live in the words of the person doing the insulting," Damon added, quieter now. "It lives just as easily in the silence of people who know something is wrong and decide speaking up is too inconvenient." Helena absorbed that without argument, and something in her expression suggested she intended to carry it further than a single conversation on a park bench. She offered to testify publicly about what she'd witnessed, and she offered Damon a position at her own firm, something with real title and real security behind it. "I don't need a better version of what happened at that dinner," he told her. "Where you finally notice me once you find out I'm worth something on paper. I need people to see the value in a man carrying trays the same way they'd see it in a man carrying a title." Helena accepted the correction rather than defending herself against it, and from that point on, something between them shifted from guilt into something closer to genuine partnership. She began quietly reviewing internal Mercer Access records afterward, starting with version histories tied to the Horizon platform, looking for anything that could confirm what Damon already knew to be true. What she found was suggestive but incomplete fragments of code repositories that hinted at an older origin without proving who had built it first. She needed something more specific, something only the platform's original architect could provide. That was when Damon told her for the first time out loud about the fingerprint he'd left behind in the original Crestline build 7 years earlier. It was, he admitted to Helena, the same week he'd been signing away his company in that hospital conference room, and he'd written the string almost without thinking, needing something of hers close to the work, even as he was preparing to let the work go. No public documentation described it. No outside engineer would ever think to look for it. Only the person who wrote it would know it existed at all. Helena used her access and her professional network to trace it, spending long nights after her official work hours combing through archived repositories that Mercer Access had never expected anyone outside the company to examine closely. Within days, she had assembled a case far more solid than anything either of them had started with. Version histories carried Damon's name buried in early commit logs Mercer Access had never bothered to scrub completely. Hospital and legal records confirmed the timeline of his equity sale 7 years earlier the same week. Mila underwent surgery, the dates lining up so precisely that Helena sat staring at the screen for several minutes before she could bring herself to call Damon with what she'd found. Internal emails showed engineers had flagged the very same 3 flaws Damon named at dinner. Months of exchanges where junior staff raised concerns that were quietly closed out by senior management without resolution. Other messages showed Victoria herself had received those warnings directly and continued publicly describing Horizon as her own singular achievement anyway, never once acknowledging the risks sitting inside the very platform she was preparing to launch. Helena wanted to release everything immediately, certain the evidence spoke for itself and would end the controversy within a single news cycle. He agreed to move forward together, but only under conditions he set himself. Helena could verify and organize the evidence. For the first time since the dinner, Damon felt something closer to control returning to his hands. Not because the danger had passed, but because he had finally chosen to stop carrying it entirely alone. That fragile sense of control didn't survive the week. Victoria's communications team released a report to several financial outlets accusing Damon of abandoning Crestline during a critical growth period, framing his equity sale as a self-interested exit rather than a father's desperate choice. The report never mentioned a hospital, a heart defect, or a 3-year-old girl waiting on a surgical table. It painted him instead as a bitter former founder nursing resentment, someone now weaponizing accusations of discrimination to extract sympathy and leverage. Reporters who had never spoken to Damon quoted the report as though it were established fact, and within a day the framing had hardened into the accepted version of events for anyone only skimming headlines. Corporate clients who had booked events at Astor House began canceling within days, unwilling to be associated with a restaurant now tangled up in a controversy involving a major tech executive, people who now watch their paychecks shrink because of a dinner they hadn't even served. Rubin never once suggested Damon had done anything wrong, but Damon could see the toll settling into the restaurant regardless. Coworkers avoiding his eyes not out of blame but out of the discomfort of not knowing what to say to him anymore. He resigned before Rubin ever had to consider letting him go, walking into the back office one afternoon and setting his apron on the desk without ceremony. "You've done nothing but protect me," he told Rubin. "I won't let that cost you, the people who work here." Rubin walked him to the door that last evening instead of letting him leave quietly through the kitchen, shaking his hand the way he might have shaken the hand of a business partner rather than an employee. "This isn't finished," Rubin told him. "Whatever happens next, you call me first." Damon nodded, unable to say much else without his voice catching, and stepped out into a Brooklyn evening that suddenly felt far less certain than it had a month earlier. The restaurant lights glowing behind him in a window he no longer had any reason to walk back through. The damage reached further than the restaurant. That agreement collapsed within a week, the landlord citing vague concerns about liability after reading the same articles circulating about Damon's past. 3 years of saving, 3 years of careful planning evaporated over a single phone call. Damon never even got to be part of a voicemail left on his phone citing unspecified concerns and wishing him luck elsewhere. Helena offered to buy the property herself through an intermediary company and quietly lease it back to him, insulating him from any landlord's second thoughts about his name. Damon refused immediately, almost reflexively telling her he had no interest in owing anyone anything, especially not something this large. Self-respect doesn't mean turning every offer of help into an insult. Helena told him more directly than she'd spoken to him before. Damon answered that he simply didn't want to be indebted to anyone, and Helena pointed out without cruelty but without softening it either that his refusal to accept help from anyone was no longer only costing him. Mila was living inside of his isolation too, along with Ruben and every coworker who had already lost income defending a decision that wasn't fully theirs to defend. Damon didn't have an answer ready for that. He'd built his independence into something close to armor over the years. Somewhere underneath the principle he recognized was simply fear of being taken advantage of, again dressed up as strength. And Helena's words sat with him longer than he wanted to admit, following him home that evening and refusing to quiet down even as he tried to focus on making Mila's dinner instead. I thought about all the people who had promised him partnership back at Crestline and disappeared the moment the company stopped being convenient to associate with, and he understood why some part of him had decided years ago that needing no one was safer than needing someone who might eventually walk away. The lowest point arrived without warning the way the worst moments usually do. A journalist working for one of the outlets covering Victoria's version of events tracked down Mila's school, and someone led a reporter close enough to approach her directly in the schoolyard during recess. She tried to answer the first question, then the second, her voice growing smaller as the reporter kept pressing without giving her room to catch up. Mila panicked and ran cutting across the sidewalk toward the street without checking for traffic the way Damon had taught her 100 times before. She wasn't hurt, not physically, but something in Damon broke completely the moment he got the call and arrived to find her shaking on the sidewalk, a stranger's hand still resting awkwardly on her shoulder trying to keep her calm. He carried her home wrapped in his coat, her small body trembling against him the whole ride, and he sat beside her bed until she finally fell asleep, watching her breathing settle into something even and slow. Only then did he go into the kitchen alone and make a decision that had nothing to do with fighting anymore. If he simply disappeared, he told himself Victoria would have no one left to attack, and Mila would finally be safe from strangers asking her questions she was never equipped to answer. Mila found him packing that box before she went to bed and asked one question that stopped him cold. "If she's the one lying," she said, standing in the doorway in her pajamas, "why does she get to decide that we're the ones who have to leave?" Damon had no answer for her, not that night, and he let her go back to bed without one. The next morning, he found the blueprint sitting on top of the box exactly where he'd left it, except now something was written across the back in his daughter's handwriting. The place where Dad never bows to anyone. It read in careful 10-year-old letters that had clearly taken her several tries to get straight. Some words crossed out and rewritten until she was satisfied with how they looked. He thought about Renee then, and what she would have seen watching him pack that box, and he suspected she would have asked him the same question their daughter just had. He called Helena that same morning, and then Ruben admitting out loud for the first time that he could no longer manage this on his own, and that trying to had already cost more than he was willing to keep paying. Helena answered on the second ring, and when he told her he was ready, she didn't celebrate or rush him, only asked what he needed from her first. "Told you to call me first," he said. "Now tell me what you need." Damon agreed to accept their help, but he kept the same conditions he'd set from the start. Helena would verify and distribute whatever evidence they had gathered. Ruben would provide the full unedited footage he'd quietly saved from that first night. Damon himself would be the one to stand up and speak in his own words, without anyone softening or sharpening his story on his behalf. And no matter what happened next, the goal was never going to be revenge against Victoria Mercer. It was going to be the truth spoken plainly, and whatever accountability came after it. He still didn't know how the story would end, only that he was no longer walking toward it alone, and that Mila, asleep down the hall with the blueprint now tucked safely back in its box, wouldn't have to watch her father disappear to keep her safe. Mercer Axis held the Horizon launch inside a glass ballroom filled with board members, international investors, financial press, and partners preparing to sign contracts worth more money than Damon had earned in his entire career combined. Victoria walked onto the stage that morning, intending to call the platform the greatest achievement of her career. Behind the scenes, the quiet machinery Damon had agreed to was already moving. Helena had sent verified documents to several members of the board earlier that week, choosing each recipient carefully, people known for asking hard questions rather than simply following Victoria's lead. Damon's name had been placed on the guest list through a contact Helena trusted completely, someone who owed her a favor and asked no questions about why. Ruben had already transferred the full unedited footage to a handful of phones belonging to people inside that room, timing the transfers so they would arrive quietly rather than all at once. Victoria noticed Damon's name on the list before the doors even opened, and she reacted the way she always reacted to anything threatening to slip outside her control. When Damon walked through the entrance in a plain gray suit, security closed in within seconds, hands already reaching toward his arm. Victoria seized the moment, turning to the room and announcing that this man had threatened her once already and was now attempting to force his way into a private event. Damon didn't raise his voice, and he didn't pull away from the hands gripping his arm. "Did you ever see me as an engineer?" he asked loud enough to carry across the room. "Before you knew my name?" Victoria said nothing. "When I wore a uniform, you decided I couldn't understand technology," Damon continued. "When I pushed back against being insulted, you called me dangerous. When evidence proved I built this platform, you called me a bitter man looking for attention." He turned slightly toward the board members seated near the front. "The problem was never that she didn't know who I was. The problem is she decided who I was allowed to be the moment she looked at me." Security began to move him toward the exit, but an investor near the front stood up, one of several who had already received Helena's documents earlier that week, and asked the room to let him finish. Another guest confirmed openly that the materials circulating did appear authentic, and a ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd that Victoria could feel even from the stage. He described the same 3 flaws he'd named at dinner, and then for the first time in public, he mentioned the small validation string buried inside the forecasting module, the one built around a phrase his daughter used to repeat when she was 3 years old. A Mercer Access engineer sitting near the back of the room straightened in his seat, recognizing every detail Damon described as accurate technical language no outsider could have faked convincingly. Damon let her finish without interrupting. Then he told the room plainly that he had signed the sale of his company inside a hospital conference room while his daughter waited 2 floors up for emergency heart surgery. "I lost a company," he said. "I kept my daughter. If I had to choose again tomorrow, I'd sign those same papers without hesitation." Helena stood near the side of the ballroom and confirmed quietly that the documents had already reached the entire board. Ruben, watching from the back, sent the full, unedited footage to phones throughout the room within seconds. Victoria could lock the main screen, but she couldn't lock every device in a room full of investors already reaching for their phones, and within minutes the footage was playing silently across dozens of small screens at once. Guests watched. A board member near the front called for the main screen to be unlocked, and after a tense moment someone complied, letting the full footage play across the central display for everyone to see. The original design documents appeared next, projected beside the footage, and Damon turned to Victoria and asked her directly to explain the 3 structural flaws in a platform she had spent months calling her personal achievement. She reached for corporate language, vague phrases about risk tolerance and market responsiveness, but Damon pressed further into the specific mechanics, and she had no answer that held together under any real scrutiny. Victoria said nothing after that. For the first time in her career, money, position, and assumption failed to decide who deserved to be believed in that room. News of the suspension broke within the hour, and this time the story carried far more context than the 11-second clip ever had, forcing outlets that had repeated Victoria's version of events weeks earlier to quietly walk it back. Mercer Access formally acknowledged Damon as the platform's original architect within days and offered him a substantial royalty agreement tied to its continued use. He turned down an offer to return as chief technology officer, telling Helena privately that he had no interest in inheriting the empire Victoria had built on his work. Victoria lost her position as chief executive once the board confirmed she had known the technology's true origins and continued building her public reputation on a story she understood to be false. Nobody framed her downfall as a woman losing to a man, and Damon made a point of correcting anyone who suggested otherwise. Mercer Access committed publicly to transparent crediting of employee contributions, a formal process for handling discrimination complaints, and a full review of hiring and promotion practices across the company. Damon told Helena quietly and only once over coffee a few weeks after the board's decision that policy changes were only ever a beginning. That real change would have to come from how people actually chose to see and treat one another day to day. Damon used part of his royalty agreement to set up a fund for Mila's future, and the rest to finally open the small storefront he'd once feared he'd lost for good. Price and Pine wasn't a grand restaurant. It had an open kitchen, a small table in the corner where Mila did her homework most evenings, a handwritten menu, and a staff that Damon made sure was treated fairly from the very first day. Above the staff station hung a single line painted simply on the wall: "No one who walks into this room is smaller than anyone else in it." Damon still worked the floor himself some evenings, greeting customers by name the same way he always had, not because he needed the money anymore, but because he wanted Mila to understand that the work itself had never made him small. And Mila watched all of it from her corner table, absorbing something her father had never needed to explain to her in words. One evening, setting the table together, Mila asked if Victoria was a bad person. Damon thought about it honestly before answering. She did wrong things and she had to answer for them, he said. But hating her isn't the point. The point is that we don't become like her. Victoria once believed power meant the ability to make other people go silent. Damon proved that real power was standing against injustice without letting anger turn him into the very thing he was fighting. Prejudice doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lives quietly in assumptions, in glances, in the casual certainty of someone who has decided in advance who deserves to be heard. Fighting it was never about revenge. It was about bringing the truth into the light, demanding accountability, and building something better for whoever walked through the door next.